Okay, so let's start here. From the standpoint of you being in government and the conversations that you were having with various people behind the scenes in the Ministry of Defense, when the UFO issue came up, or when you encountered stories that weren't terrestrial, like you said, many of the footage or much of the information that you received when you were doing this came from just basically domestic sources or sources that weren't top secret. But when it did hit that thing of saying, okay, this is something that we need to have further study or further investigation on, what were the mechanics of that after that was, I guess, decided upon, if that makes sense?
Yes, I mean, I think inevitably we put the bulk of our effort into the cases which look most promising, and inevitably the center of gravity drifted towards our own people. So sightings involving military personnel, sightings where pilots saw these things, and particularly sightings where we had other forms of evidence over and above just the eyewitness testimony, even if it was good eyewitness testimony from our own people, but where we had, for example, radar data, or where we had photos or videos that we could get to work on. So those were the sorts of cases that were really interesting, and that's where some of the classified material comes in as we get diving into capabilities of military radar systems, imagery analysis, resources and capabilities in the intelligence community, that sort of thing.
When was there any bias in regards to the areas that these kept showing up? Because, like you mentioned before, you guys had access to radar data where you can, I guess, isolate or at the very least find certain areas around the globe that this seems to be coming, showing up in. Were there any specific areas around the globe or any specific areas where this seems to be a source by which they frequent? And what I mean by that is, at least going by the information that's coming out in the States, it seems that many of the craft that these guys are taking pictures of and images of, they're small. And there's a question on whether or not the location of the craft are coming from water. Meaning there seems to be this kind of association with water that keeps coming up in the reports of the objects. I guess I'm asking in your capacity in the Ministry of Defense, in regards to what you could say, because I understand that there's going to be limits around this. Were there areas where you could say, okay, this seems to be a bias in this particular region of the world where this seems to show itself?
Again, it's a really multifaceted question because there are a lot of variables here. Firstly, one could say in general terms that there is some fairly compelling evidence that some of the best UFO sightings are around military bases. But then, of course, you've got the sort of confounding factor that, well, how much of those sightings, how many of them might be attributable to our own technology, secret black programs, that sort of thing, next generation aircraft, missiles, drones. Now, to some extent, we can figure that out because we know where we test our own kit. But that's one issue, the question of hotspots around military bases. The second issue and the problem is that we don't have an even spread of data. So, for example, there are some countries where, because of the closed political systems, in terms of them being adversaries, or because of language issues, culture, whatever, there simply isn't either the reporting chain in the first place or access to reports that do get made. So we've got a very uneven and patchy situation there. And a final confounding factor is that air defense radars are very much configured for terrestrial threats. And it's only, for example, space tracking radars, the sorts of things at the ballistic missile early warning centers that maybe give you a wider capability, and that immediately gets you into sort of fairly highly classified areas.
The people who were involved in that, everybody came forward. There was an investigation into it, including radiation. From the standpoint of the ground, when these guys were taking measurements of this, I would imagine this is also one of the cases that had to get put up for review. What was the thought behind this one? I mean, this was one of those cases where it was human contact, or at the very least, it's thought to be human contact Am I correct on that? And what were there symptoms for the individuals who were there? Meaning, were there human effects for the people who were actually there in the encounter itself, not just effects on the ground and effects on the fauna nearby?
Yes, there were. Again, we're getting into a fairly sensitive area, but fortunately, this time, one of the reports has been declassified. There was an intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon, a British intelligence assessment, codenamed Project Condign, and there is a line in there which says it might be postulated that essentially the Rendlesham Forest incident was a case where the witnesses were exposed to UAP radiation, so unidentified aerial phenomena radiation, for longer periods than normal. And yes, some of those witnesses have complained of health issues. We know that the Pentagon's ATIP program did look at human effects. Certainly, I'm aware that some of the Rendlesham witnesses over the years have been asked for blood samples, DNA samples, things like that. The VA was involved. Various senators got involved to try and get these people a settlement. I can't talk about that much because of HIPAA, but yeah, it's a really, really complicated story with lots of twists and turns.
Well, compare for a moment with Operation Saucer, where the people who were on the ground, who were on site, you had the Brazilian military, Air Force, that investigated the story. Like you said, it's on Brazil. Well, I'm saying it's on Brazil's website. They give certain information, even though some of the information is in the black. But are there comparisons or similarities between the effects that the people were experiencing there, as reported by the released information, with the effects of some of the people in Rendlesham?
Yes, there do seem to be some similarities, and I'm aware certainly that some of the ATIP people and some of the people associated with that program and maybe similar programs have taken an interest in the situation in Brazil, and certainly, yes, are aware of Rendlesham Forest too. I mean, this is close to a smoking gun because, of course, what you're always looking for is a physical effect that is something you can study after the event. I mean, the trouble with UFO sightings, of course, is that they're transitory. But where you've got these permanent physical effects, it's almost like following the breadcrumbs.
Are there any cases that you came in contact with outside of Rendlesham? Because I know that's one of the biggest ones. Like you said, the declassification of it kind of hints at there could be a there to it, especially with the radiation and the physical effects that seem to be associated with it. Not to mention the classifications in and of itself hints at there's something there, even if they don't necessarily let you see what the classifications are. Were there any other cases where you came across, similar to Rendlesham, where you left that case thinking to yourself, wow, or you left that case concerned? Like, I'm just kind of curious on like the day-to-day basis of your job and the things that you encountered in the context of that job. And I know you can't tell things that are still in the black or still in top secret, but I am curious about you and how you proceed in that job. Were there things where you left that job thinking to yourself that you were concerned, or things where you thought to yourself, there is such a larger reality here that we are not getting the picture? Like, there's something disconnecting here, but there's some larger gravity here where it's not just interdimensional fish that we're coming across, that there's something else. And either concern, either hope, or either this, yeah, there's a there to it, but a threat is not necessarily assessed. I guess I'm trying to figure out what's in your head, even if you can't necessarily tell what you directly experienced. I hope that question makes sense.
Yes, it does. Well, firstly, in terms of the threat, I have gone on the record as saying, and I'm pretty sure that people like Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon have said the same thing, that essentially, whatever we're dealing with here, you've got to regard it as a potential threat. And anything unidentified in your airspace is automatically a defense and national security issue in and of itself, particularly in these circumstances where the capabilities seem to be so impressive in terms of speeds, maneuvers, acceleration, etc., etc. Now, there's even a threat equation, and a threat is usually defined as being a product of capability times intent. As I say, we know capability seems pretty impressive, and we've got data, for example, measurement and signature intelligence data suggesting that the capability is pretty impressive. What we don't have are data on intent. And if you don't have that, you can't solve the equation. You can't define whether there's a threat or not. And in that circumstance, it's better to assume that there's a threat and be surprised be relieved when one doesn't materialize than to assume everything's fine and then get caught with your pants down if a threat suddenly emerges. Now, in terms of when I was doing the job at the Ministry of Defense, I'll give you a general answer and a specific answer. Generally, the sorts of cases that concerned me most were near misses, and we had several, between commercial aircraft and UFOs. So it's a flight safety issue too. And specifically, we had, and this wasn't a near miss, but just to give you another example of a sort of case that interested us, and we kicked it up the chain of command to senior military personnel. We had a wave of sightings over a period of 6 hours in March 1993. Huge triangular-shaped craft and 2 military bases were directly overflown. Lots of military witnesses, thorough investigation, and yet whatever this object or objects was, it eluded us. And the case file simply concludes there is strong evidence that on the night concerned, an unidentified object was operating in the UK's air defence region, and this must be regarded as of defence significance.
Nick, that's astonishing. I mean, because think of what you just told me for the moment. Within the context of a very advanced nation, within the defense area of that nation, an object that we weren't able to identify that seemed to have pretty significant properties was able to act in British airspace. And by the way, it's not just British airspace, it's American airspace, Soviet airspace, et cetera, Russian airspace. How did the British government deal with that? I mean, like, what was the rationalization for that? Like, when at the end of the day, when the people go home and after writing a report on that, what do you say about that? I mean, because either China and Russia has capability that is phenomenal, and they got it somewhere that we are entirely unaware of, or it's not us. And the British government has to know that and has to come to that same kind of calculus of, oh my God, either they can do this or it's not us. I mean, am I wrong in my assessment on that?
No, you're right, and indeed that's exactly what Marco Rubio was saying recently when he essentially said, look, I'd rather we were dealing with extraterrestrials, because if this is Russia or China, frankly, we're in big trouble, because the US has been left standing by some sort of technological breakthrough they've made. Now, we in the UK, we faced a similar situation, and with these sorts of cases that were unexplained, it was troubling to us. But it's like the analogy I use. It's like investigation of crimes. You solve most of them, but the ones you don't solve, they stick around, and they stick around in the case files, and they stick around in your mind, and they are extremely frustrating and concerning, because you think somebody's gotten away with something here. But like an unsolved crime in a police file, these big unsolved cases, like Rendlesham Forest, like the other one I mentioned, like many more all around the world, until or unless some new piece of evidence emerges, they just sit there unsolved. And yeah, that is unsatisfactory. I mean, look at the U.S. Navy sightings. You know, these These aircraft carriers, billion-dollar assets, and the U.S. Navy's position is we don't know. As I've said before, that's not good enough.
And not just we don't know. They've upped it and says we're going to accept information from people talking about all sort of identified flying objects, but we're not going to tell you what that is. Like it's not even just we don't know. It's we're not going to tell you when we do find out. It's very unsatisfying. So let's go for there for the moment. What does it mean? If the U.S. comes out with a report and says we are not alone, which is, look, listening to what these guys are saying, these guys, it sounds like they're talking about technology. If they come out and say we're not alone, what does it mean? What does it mean politically? And what does it mean for us as human beings, even from the standpoint of us trying to understand what is taking place in the larger world? This stuff is in the black. And you're stuck with, basically, we're stuck with what they tell us. So just to close it out, we have about 3 minutes left. What does this mean? And how are governments going to internalize this information if that report comes out with the U.S. saying we're not alone?
Well, first, I very much doubt that the report will say that. I think the very furthest it will go, if indeed it ever mentions extraterrestrials in the unclassified summary, I think the furthest they'll go is to say that they can't rule out the possibility. But in terms of what it will really mean, and let's suppose I'm wrong, and let's suppose they did come out with that, yes, it would touch every aspect of our lives: politics, religion, science, technology, economics, the military, etc. And absolutely, not just at a governmental level, but at a personal level too. Our personal belief systems, our paradigms, our view of who we are and where we fit in the universe, everything would have to change. So it would be truly paradigm shifting if it happens.
Like you said, it would be extreme if it did. I mean, it would be a heavy move of the bar if they went from ridicule to all of a sudden, yes, it's real. And then look, the country or the world will have to deal with that. One more last thing, pursuant to what Shane was saying for the moment, when you, like you said, when you took that role, you didn't take that role with a huge belief set one way or the other. It was more so, this is an interesting job, and as you went to do it, I suppose, what you thought about this got formed over the course of the 20 years. Within the context of what you were doing, did it ever become aware why the secrecy? Meaning, was it, okay, we just don't want people to know potential capabilities? Was it, we think that this will revolutionize and change society in such a way where it would be disruptive? Was there any conversation that you could talk about that was had on that very specific issue of why is this stuff in the black, at least from the context of the United Kingdom?
The secrecy is almost exclusively because of technology. Whatever we're dealing with here, the nation that first figures out this can maybe derive technologies from it. And obviously, in that situation, you want to be the first. And if lots of different countries are working on it, you don't necessarily want any of them, even allies, let alone adversaries, to know what you're doing and what progress you're making. Now, the declassified intelligence study I mentioned, Project Condign, went into a little bit of that, and it talked about novel military applications that might result from a better understanding of what we're dealing with here. So I think it's technology acquisition rather than societal shock that is behind the secrecy here.
Nick, permit me 30 seconds to follow this up. Is that why they're exposing it? Meaning, when I had the opportunity to talk to Elizondo, and I kind of made the point that science is one of those things where it seems to work better when you're dealing with other people and other people can put heads together and everything else. And that there's maybe a limiting factor in trying to keep the stuff isolated. And if you believe that your country can basically take advantage of the technology faster than other countries can take advantage of the technology, would that be a justification to try to get it out, especially if you feel like you're falling behind technologically to other countries? Say, for example, the contest with China and the United States in that competition. I think a lot of this stuff has reasons in political or based in political reasons. Is that out of whack or not so much from the way and from the position where you were in government that, well, no, those wouldn't be reasons to bring something like that out. What are your thoughts on that? Just the thought behind that.
It might be a factor, but I can't help but think there's something else at play here, because we've seen a 180-degree flip in the way this subject has been handled. And it's almost as if now they're promoting it and pushing it and getting it out there. If I had to guess, and it would just be a guess, I would say that somebody's realized that maybe something's coming. Maybe you can't keep the genie in the bottle anymore. And in that circumstance, you want to get out ahead of the narrative and be sort of leading the conversation rather than reacting to things. So maybe that's the answer. Maybe, as I say, something is coming.
Does that concern you? Like
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I was just curious. When Stephen Bass was on the show, I was asking him the same. Like, because it's we cover politics on the show. And part of the thing with the politics or political angle is oftentimes things are put in a way that gives people an impression of things, that pushes people in a point of view that drops context. And so the individual believes that they're thinking and they believe they're coming to a conclusion when really the conclusion they're coming to is basically incentivize. My biggest concern about this issue is that what gets put out and what gets explained is explained in a way where people have a certain purview of the world that is not necessarily something that came to their own, but was incentivized based on the way the information was delivered. That scares me. That terrifies me about this issue. I want to thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate this. I know we had a lot of technical glitches and everything else, but absolutely appreciate it. The voice that you guys...
No, we had a great conversation, covered a lot of interesting territory, I think. So thanks for having me on the show.
No, thank you for coming on. The voice that you guys are listening to is Nick Pope, freelance British journalist, media commentator, and former civil servant, Wilson employee at the British government's Ministry of Defense for the last 21 years. Pope was responsible, among other duties, for investigating UFO phenomena to determine whether it had defense significance. You guys are listening to Fault Lines, where at this point, I guess Fault Lines is over with. I want to thank you guys for joining us. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all.